Europe scrambles to stop an energy meltdown.
EU ministers push ban on Russian gas as US profits surge.
Historic €750 billion energy deal reshapes global power map.
Why Europe's plan to cut prices may backfire hard.
This isn't just an energy plan. It's a power grab disguised as relief. Europe is spending $750 billion to escape Moscow's gas grab and landing right inside Washington's. 15% of its energy still flows from Russia, yet US tankers are raking in record profits. So who's really winning Europe's energy war? The people freezing or the exporters cashing in?
The announcement came with confidence. 7 urgent actions, a bold promise, bring down prices for families and factories. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stood before the cameras, calling it a turning point. Europe, at last, taking back control of its energy future. But behind the optimism, the numbers told a different story. After 2 years of war, sanctions, and supply shocks, Europe still imported roughly 15% of its LNG from Russia. The rest, the lifeline keeping the lights on, increasingly sailed in from across the Atlantic. By mid-2025, the US had become Europe's largest supplier of liquefied natural gas, with exports worth more than €750 billion since the Ukraine invasion. That's not just a market adjustment, it's a seismic shift in global dependence. Europe escaped one hand on its energy valve, only to accept another. The Commission's 7-point plan looks simple on paper. Emergency tax cuts for energy bills, a joint purchase platform to negotiate gas prices, accelerated renewables, and a call to phase out Russian gas entirely by 2027. But each step had a catch. Every relief measure meant more import contracts with the United States and long-term LNG infrastructure that locks Europe into decades of dependence on American supply. Pipelines from the east were replaced by ships from the west.
For US energy firms, it was a gold rush. Companies like Cheniere Energy and Sempra saw record-high revenues as European buyers outbid Asian markets to secure shipments. Contracts stretching 25 years forward were signed almost overnight. The same molecules of gas that once flowed cheaply through Russian pipelines now cross the Atlantic at 5 times the cost. And European taxpayers, through subsidies and relief funds, were footing the bill. The irony is staggering. Europe launched its energy rescue to protect citizens from price shocks, yet average household electricity bills in major EU economies rose between 20% and 40% in 2024 alone. Factories in Germany, France, and Italy warned of shutdowns. Steel and chemical plants, the backbone of European industry, relocated to the United States, where energy was cheaper. Europe had freed itself politically, but was bleeding economically. The United States, meanwhile, called it a strategic partnership, a win-win. Energy security for Europe, jobs and profits for America. But look closer. The LNG boom did more than fill Europe's storage tanks. It rewired transatlantic power. Washington gained leverage over Europe's fuel costs, timelines, and climate policies. When the White House talked about shared energy values, it meant shared dependence, but on American terms.
To understand how Europe got here, we need to rewind. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia supplied nearly 40% of the EU's natural gas. The Nord Stream pipelines made it cheap and steady. Then came the explosions, the sanctions, and the political shockwave. Within months, Europe had to replace a third of its energy supply. Coal was revived, nuclear plants were reopened, and every port scrambled to build LNG terminals. The US stepped in fast. Tankers arrived in Spain, the Netherlands, and Germany. Billions of cubic meters of gas compressed into supercooled liquid. Each shipment cost millions. Each arrival was hailed as a symbol of Western unity. But unity has a price, and that price shows up in Europe's electricity bills every month. Inside Brussels, officials insist this is temporary. They say once renewables scale up and infrastructure matures, prices will stabilize. But industry analysts warn otherwise. The contracts Europe signed tie it to US LNG until the 2040s. Even if solar and wind expand, the continent is locked into decades of payments to American suppliers. Meanwhile, the EU's ambition to ban Russian gas by 2027 faces a harsh reality. 15% of imports still come from Russia, mainly through LNG routes that can't be cut without hurting energy-poor member states. For countries like Hungary and Austria, complete divestment isn't just a political decision, it's an economic risk to millions of households. So Europe walks a tightrope between principle and practicality, between morality and mortgage payments.
Now, as winter approaches, the stakes rise again. Gas storage levels are high, but prices remain volatile. Any cold snap could trigger a surge, and as Europe leans on US suppliers, American domestic prices face pressure too. Europe's problem has become America's profit and potentially America's own problem down the line. Because the more Europe pays, the more exporters sell. The more exporters sell, the tighter US domestic supply becomes. A win for companies, a strain for consumers. And it all feeds into the same question: can Europe really buy its way out of an energy crisis, or is it building a new one with different logos on the tankers? The answer lies in the next phase of this story, the global consequences and the slow, inevitable reckoning that comes when politics meets physics and profit. Europe's 7-point plan was supposed to mark independence, but in practice, it marked a transfer of control. Not from Moscow to Brussels, but from pipelines buried underground to contracts signed in Houston. Across the Atlantic, the boom is visible. U.S. liquefied gas exports are up more than 50% since 2022. Louisiana and Texas ports are expanding nonstop. New terminals in Corpus Christi and Calcasieu Pass are under construction. The U.S. is now the world's largest LNG exporter, a title built almost entirely on Europe's desperation.
Analysts estimate that 750 billion euros in European payments have flowed into American energy firms since the war began. That's more than the annual GDP of Switzerland, and it's still rising. The European Commission calls it strategic diversification, but the numbers tell a truth. Each cargo of LNG shipped from the US burns enormous energy to chill, transport, and regasify, making it costlier and dirtier than pipeline gas ever was. Europe's climate goals now collide head-on with its survival strategy. Factories are the first casualties. In Germany, BASF, Europe's biggest chemical producer, has already moved parts of its ammonia and plastics production to the United States, chasing cheaper gas. Steelmakers in Italy and Spain have cut output. Fertilizer plants in France are operating at half capacity. Jobs aren't disappearing, they're migrating, and they're landing right where the gas is cheapest: America. For Washington, this is geopolitics wrapped in profit. Every new LNG terminal strengthens U.S. bargaining power. Every tanker to Europe increases America's leverage in climate talks, trade negotiations, and defense funding debates. Europe wanted autonomy, it ended up deepening dependency, just with a friendlier face on the invoice. Still, officials in Brussels defend the plan. They argue that security comes first and that U.S. supply is at least predictable. True, but predictability comes at a price. The long-term contracts signed in 2023 and 2024 lock Europe into buying fixed volumes for 15 to 25 years, regardless of demand. Even if renewable capacity explodes, Europe still must pay for gas it no longer needs. That's not flexibility, that's financial handcuffs.
And as those bills pile up, another contradiction emerges. Europe is trying to lower energy prices at home while subsidizing the very imports keeping them high. It's the classic loop of modern policy: solve today's pain by borrowing from tomorrow's crisis. Inside the US, the boom feels like victory, for now. Thousands of new jobs, billions in export revenue, politicians pointing to energy dominance. But LNG infrastructure is expensive, and local communities near Gulf Coast plants complain of rising emissions, water stress, and housing costs. The profits flow upward, the side effects stay local. And there's a deeper risk, one few mention on cable news. If European demand cools or renewable transitions accelerate, the US could face a glut of overbuilt LNG capacity. Billions invested in terminals could become stranded assets. So the alliance that looks unbreakable today could by the 2030s turn into another transatlantic tension point, Europe demanding price cuts, America demanding loyalty. Meanwhile, Russia hasn't vanished from the map. Despite sanctions, Russian LNG still slips into European ports through re-export routes. Spain, Belgium, and France quietly processing cargoes labeled from intermediaries. The share has dropped from 40% pre-war to 15% now, but that 15% matters. It keeps some countries stable and exposes others to political shame. When EU ministers promise a total ban by 2027, energy analysts quietly shake their heads. Banning Russian gas sounds moral, enforcing it is logistical chaos. Europe lacks enough terminals, pipelines, and storage to replace that final 15% without triggering shortages. So what happens if winter 2026 arrives before new wind and solar projects are ready? The ban meets reality, and reality wins.
Beyond Europe, the ripple spreads. Asia now competes for the same U.S. cargoes, driving prices up globally. Developing nations in Africa and South Asia, which once relied on affordable LNG, are priced out entirely. Hospitals in Pakistan ration electricity. Europe's rescue becomes someone else's blackout. This is how global energy works, a zero-sum chain. When one region buys security, another inherits scarcity. And as long as the world burns gas, whoever controls the tankers controls the terms. Still, there's a twist the headline mess. Europe's crisis may accelerate the clean energy transition faster than politics ever could. Wind and solar installations are up 40% since 2023. Battery storage capacity is doubling each year. For the first time, renewables supplied more power to Europe in 2024 than fossil fuels. Pain has become motivation. Necessity is forcing change. But transitions take time, and time is money. Until renewables dominate, Europe will keep paying premium prices to keep homes warm and lights on. And in that gap between ambition and infrastructure lies the true battlefield of this decade. So who really wins? Not the families checking thermostats in Warsaw, not the small businesses in Paris cutting hours to save on power. The winners are the exporters, the traders who turn geopolitics into quarterly profit. And yet, beneath the cynicism, there's a faint optimism. Europe is diversifying, building storage, learning the cost of dependence. Maybe this time, the lesson will stick. Still, as 2027 looms, the question remains unanswered. When the last Russian shipment stops, will Europe finally stand on its own or just switch suppliers while the bills keep climbing?
Every crisis rewrites the balance of power. The 1970s had OPEC, the 2020s have LNG, and in both, the story ends the same way. Ordinary people paying for political choices made far above their pay grade. So as headlines celebrate the end of Russian gas, remember what's really ending, Europe's illusion of cheap energy. And what's beginning is a long, uneasy alliance where freedom costs more than dependence ever did. Maybe one day Europe will look back on this moment as the turning point when pain bought progress. Or maybe it will see it as the start of a new addiction dressed in democratic colors. Either way, the lesson is brutally clear. Energy independence isn't free. Someone always pays the bill. And this time, it might just be all of us.